Hello, my name is Stephen Gluckstern. I'm the chairman and CEO of Santa Fe Farms, and on behalf of South by Southwest and Grade Hemp Seed, I'd like to welcome you to our fireside chat with Kim Kovacs, the CEO of the Arcview Group.
Hi, Stephen.
Good morning.
Pleasure to be here.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. And so just for a little context, so the Arcview Group is a place where investors and companies get to meet and interact in what we would call a programmatic sense. We used to do a lot of live events. We've been around for 11 years and really supporting what I would say the cannabis and hemp industry in fundraising. And so this is going to be a great spot for us to have this conversation.
It's great. Well, we named it Seed Capital, a little play on words, obviously. Tell us a little about the beginning of Arcview 11 years ago. How did it get started, and how did the focus turn on to cannabis?
Yeah, so it was started by Troy Dayton and Steve D'Angelo, so two well-known names in this industry. And what they found is that, as companies were starting to become, cannabis and legal entities, both either in the medical space or in the now new adult space, lack of capital. And it was really hard for companies to get started because they couldn't get a bank loan. They couldn't have access to traditional venture capital firms or, traditional equity markets. And so they started with events and started bringing people together where we would showcase companies. They would pitch. Investors would, see the pitches, get to meet the entrepreneurs, and then being able to then invest. So we've invested over $300 million in the cannabis space. We have been very active in legislative change and bringing about new legal markets. And as you can imagine, over 11 years, we've kind of seen it all. And, the ebbs and flows. We also started doing a lot of research and promoting research in the industry through one of our companies called Arcview Market Research. And since then, we've also expanded into other things. So now we have a venture firm, which is called the Arcview Collective. So it's a group of members that have dedicated capital. We also have Arcview Capital, which is our broker-dealer, and also a consulting group. And so we've really expanded our reach and supporting hemp now too, as well. So after the Farm Bill in 2018, we took a real, stance with hemp as well as cannabis.
Let's go back a little bit, talk about cannabis. I'm interested in the beginning, the origins here. Obviously, you talked about the ebbs and flows. It's not been a straight line. It's not been a straight line in terms of returns. What are some of the lessons that you and your investors have sort of learned over that 11-year period?
Well, we're still learning. So, we listen to ourselves every day and kind of, lessons learned. But I would say the biggest one is that, there was a lot of exuberance in the earlier days of cannabis investing. I would say it was kind of more of a seller's market than a buyer's market at that point. And so when there was a cannabis company that looked pretty good, they attracted a lot of investors, and early investors. And so I would say investors previous to some of the things that have happened didn't do a lot of due diligence, or didn't do enough due diligence in certain areas. And we would kind of let things go on the side because we had bigger problems. Like, could they get a bank account? Did they have the right licenses? Could they expand, even within their own state versus, not even being able to get into another state? And so there were all these other compounding problems. And so things like, did they even have D&O insurance? Didn't even hit the radar. And so what we're finding now is that more investors are coming in and they're looking for those things. They're looking for the traditional due diligence checklist, if you will. And so we're really seeing that evolution. And I think it's great personally because it brings in more money. It brings in more capital, brings in more traditional type investment. And so I think it's a great thing for the industry.
Yeah, it's interesting, sort of this notion of maturity of industries, right? In the beginning of any industry, that no one exactly knows what's going on. The capital rushes in. You're trying to figure out where you might put it or might not, and that you need some of that maturation process to understand what it is. And how did you personally get involved in cannabis?
So, we all sort of have an origin story about cannabis. I wouldn't say it's an easy industry to just say, hey, I want to get into this and go forth. So for me personally, my mother-in-law was addicted to opioids. And so she was a cancer survivor, and her pain medication, really the only thing available to her was Oxycontin and fentanyl patches. And so she used them in combination, and it was just really debilitating. In fact, she couldn't really drive. She couldn't really hold a conversation. She was in the hospital frequently. And one of those episodes in the hospital, she had a severe brain bleed. And one of her friends said, try cannabis. And so she did. And she literally got off of opioids within about 3-4 months. And so this is a woman that had been on it for 10 years. And I had no idea that cannabis could do that. And so I really just got myself educated myself. I went to MJ Biz. I joined Arcview as a member. I really started to understand the industry and what, this plant could do. And here we are today, right?
So one of the things that I've learned in my time in the business is sort of that there are lots of, we'll describe them as myths about the business, right? Sort of this idea that it's something, and I'd be interested in your sort of perspective as sort of on myths and realities. Mm-hmm. If there's some one or two you might point to as things that people believe that turns out not to be true, or things that people don't believe that turns out to be true.
I would say on the THC side is that, one of the myths is that, there's money being made hand over fist. I mean, people think of, these, cannabis entrepreneurs, and they're making a lot of money in the dispensaries, and, they're burying money in their backyard, and they've got, bags of cash that they're, rolling into Las Vegas with, and things like this. And I think what really struck me is just how expensive it is to really stand up a quality cannabis company. And that probably holds true, right, with hemp as well as THC. But because you have layers of regulation, you cannot take certain expenditures as tax deductions because of 280E, which we can get into at some point, but that's a whole nother ball of wax there. And I think that's really something that people don't understand when they first get in. And they think that they could really just keep working hard or working differently. And then the other one is the illicit market. I mean, we still have a tremendous amount of product and, opportunities, I would even say, in the illicit market. And we're really trying to tackle those one by one. And as I see new states coming on with new regulations, they're starting to really look at what has happened in other states and trying to do a little better. And so I'm kind of really hopeful that some of those lessons learned, both, in the regulations and the tax structures, but also in social equity and social justice and various licensing and how those are being, distributed, and the lottery systems and various things like this, it's all really moving toward a normalization of an industry, which I'm really excited about, right? And I'm sure you've seen that in hemp as well.
There's no question that this is a long-term business. It is not an overnight business. So talk to me a little bit about some of your investors, the kind of people that are investing. Mm-hmm. Do you think they're willing to take sort of a longer run view of this, which they might not have in the beginning because they were looking for the turn of the quick buck?
Yeah, I would say, we're evolving, right? As investors, we're learning. I would say that earlier on, meaning, 2011 when we started, or 2010 when Arcview started, even through sort of 2018 and early 2019, there was this whole idea of, how do you get liquidity, right? As an angel investor, as a venture capital investor, it's not a lifestyle business. It's not a lifetime business. You want to be able to turn that capital. You want to be able to, get a return and make another investment. And so that's the model. And so a lot of people didn't kind of really understand that when they were taking venture money in. But one of the things that happened that, in hindsight, is it good? Is it not? I mean, it happened. It's the public markets in Canada, right? And it really, I would say, shortened the timeline that some people were looking for with regard to their investment. So instead of it being a 7 to 10 year investment for, like I would say, a traditional business, I was in software, I was in life science, I was in clean tech, I was in all these other businesses that had a longer tail. And now you're looking at a public company in Canada, which never came into a conversation before, in 18 months. And that just didn't seem realistic to a lot of investors. And so I think right now we are really taking a pause, taking a step back and saying, is the public market a good exit for this type of company? Or is there now capital available for not just seed, but Series A, Series B, traditional kinds of, investment rounds?
And do you have a sense of today, if on average, where your investors looking sort of at the retail end of the distribution? Are they more interested now in some of the industrial uses and industrial building of processors, or is it across the whole board that you see the interest?
Well, investors are cats and dogs, and everybody's got their own, whatever they're interested in. And we also see an alignment with, I would say, a lot of what they used to be investing in, or maybe industry experience, right? So if you have technologists who are now investing in cannabis, they're going to migrate more towards a technical play. Or if they're into life science, they're going to be more into the science and the medicine of the plant versus maybe some of the retail branding. But we do see a lot of CPG investors. So I'd say earlier in cannabis, both in cannabis and hemp, it was in the cultivation side and it was in the brand side, right? They were looking at CBD as a brand in the hemp space. And that was kind of a safe investment. And it was also pretty ubiquitous. I mean, there were a lot of companies being popped up over the last few years in CBD. And so they could kind of have their choice. They could place smaller bets, if you will, across a number of different brands. But I think what we're seeing now is, and this is really exciting for me and something I want to dig in a little bit more with you, is what I call long-term capital or permanent capital. And it's generational wealth. It's big family offices. It's ultra high net worth. It is really bringing in the capital that's going to change an industry. And to me, that's the industrialization of hemp.
And for the benefit of the people listening, they may or may not know. We want to give a little bit of background, and I'll share a little bit of sort of when we use the word industrialization, what we mean when we say that.
Why don't you take that question, since you're in the space more than I am?
Sure.
So what is industrialization of hemp?
So the hemp plant, and we have some examples of it back here, right? Most people think that you take this plant and then you basically extract the chemicals from it. And we know that those chemicals are very powerful and very important. And cannabinoids, obviously, flavonoids, terpenes, there's a whole range of chemicals. And what makes it unique is, of course, that our body has cannabinoid receptors on most of all of our cells. And so that's why pot is pot. That's why CBD is CBD and that. But it turns out that this plant is much more than that. And I think most people who are aware of the hemp plant, the Phoenicians used it thousands of years ago to create rope, to conquer the world. There's some evidence that the hemp plant itself has been around almost 12,000 years. It made it quite extraordinary as a plant. And the plant has, in addition to the leaves and the flower, which is what we're used to, right? That's what we tend to see. And certainly in the cannabis space, it was the flower where all the resins sit. It turns out that the stalk of this plant has both an outer bark, like a tree does, which is commonly now called fiber, and then the inner core, which is basically sort of a cellulose kind of product, which is called hurd or shiv. There are many, many uses for each of those two pieces, and different people have different priorities and how they think about it. We at Santa Fe Farms are very convinced that there are very important uses of those two in terms of the bark or the fiber. While you can make clothing and cloth and all things like that, you also can make advanced carbons. And carbon, we believe, is one of the most critical elements and critical materials going forward to create new batteries, create new air filtration systems. Basically, they're designing COVID masks made of what comes out of that. And then as well as the interior, which today is used for things like animal bedding and animal feed, but we believe can be used in building products and other kind of very important. So the industrialization sort of means taking this plant and having its use. Same way you look at a tree ultimately turns into 2x4s if that's what you want to make for it. And I think the hemp plant will see that same thing. And it's early days because I think most people know the story, which is the growing of hemp was only made legal for industrial uses in 2018. It suffered from prohibition back in the 20s and 30s, right, where it was basically outlawed. And so we have an 80-year, 90-year gap and just being to see. So for me, that's the industrialization, is sort of how do we use it in other forms in addition to the very important chemical forms.
Well, and, to your point is it sort of got lumped in with the THC side of marijuana. And, for probably many political reasons, it wasn't allowed to be grown and done. And I think that's an important point because the investors that we have and the ones that we work with at Arcview and, really even globally, I mean, hemp is an interesting global opportunity for many reasons. And it's education. It's really understanding that this isn't just a one-off product, but it could literally be on the shelf in any one of the stores that we go to, from fabrics to, towels and sheets to, building materials and various other things. And, as we're starting to, as investors get to understand this, we also have to understand what this life cycle looks like. And, we mentioned this before. I mean, CBD was kind of an easy one to get into, but I think the bigger money and the bigger play is in the industrial side. I really do, because you've got families that are looking at, third, fourth generation that have been in the oil business for a long time. And what are they going to do now? They want to support sustainability. They want to be, into the carbon neutral, the carbon positive footprint. They want to be able to do these things, not just for themselves, but 3 generations down. And so to me, this is such a great opportunity for them to get interested, get them educated, and then get them excited.
Yeah. No, I think the education question is actually really, really important, because people don't really understand the sort of the history of this plant and really all the things that we've talked about that it can do. And I agree with you that educating people is critically important in that regard. One of the things that you just touched on is we haven't even talked about sustainability and the value of this plant beyond just its obvious physical value. I was just reading last night an article that said an acre of hemp sequesters as much carbon as an acre of the Amazon rainforest. Oh my gosh. And it is quite, we laugh a little bit inside our shop that it's a magical plant. And in many ways, it is a magical plant. Its attributes are quite magical, not the least of which is this sustainability question and the idea that we could use less timber, we could sequester more carbon, all of those kinds of things come from the plant. And I think the truth is that's an education process. We're going to have to figure out how to educate not just investors, but obviously the average consumer, in particular with young people who are very conscious. If you said, here are these 2 products and they're quite similar, but this one is better for the environment, 9 times out of 10 people will start buying that product. So I think that's part of one of the things that the education, and part of from an investor's perspective, to think about, can we begin to produce product that is not just good for the pocketbook, but good for our environment?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, with the Biden administration looking at its sort of 12 points of sustainability and, the Hemp Industry Council saying, well, we can cover at least 10 of those. Give us a little time. We'll get to water and air, but I think you're right. I think that, there's enough of this sort of momentum and focus on really creating these longer, term opportunities and bringing in sustainability and making money at the same time. This isn't charity. This is not a nonprofit that we're talking about. We're talking about being able to make real money with real change. And to me, that's a great combination. And one that, like I said, we're seeing really resonate well, especially with, high net worth families that have made a lot of money in maybe other areas. I mean, you look at Tesla, right? I mean, you have a vision, you have a drive, and then you start to build the infrastructure around that. And I think we're on the way of doing this. It's really great.
It's interesting. We haven't quite announced it yet, but we at Santa Fe Farms are focusing on one of our areas is in building materials and building materials that come from hemp. And one of the really interesting technologies that we're going to be presenting and putting into the marketplace are basically building materials that literally sequester carbon over 100 years from when you build with them. So they are active for 100 years and continuing to sequester carbon, not just in their manufacturing. And I think those stories will resonate with people. And I think that investors in particular begin to say, if you can do that instead of tearing down forests to build houses, you can use a regenerative plant that in fact continues to sequester carbon, that there'll be tremendous interest in that. And I think tremendous investment.
Well, and, we talked a little bit about this. I'm going to ask you this question too, because I think this is an important one, especially for us at Arcview. We've been very, very much on the forefront of, we were part of the original formation of MPP. We were a part of, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, social justice, Steve D'Angelo with the Last Prisoner Project. Really big proponents on, social licensing and making sure that we're, these communities were affected by the war on drugs, let's be honest, right? And they're still being affected and they're still suffering. And not just getting a license, but the capital behind it. And so you're doing something interesting in that regard. I want to talk about that because I think that's, as you said, ESG is 3 parts, right? It's the environmental, it's the social as well, and it's the governance. So let's talk about that.
Sure. So just at a 50,000 foot level, I've always believed in the business, as I said, I'm a serial entrepreneur, that you can do well and good at the same time. And that in fact, that the money will follow. If you do the right kinds of things in the right way, you'll make the returns. The returns will be there. As we've thought about the hemp industry, one of the most interesting sort of historical issues in this country has been the treatment of the Native Americans and indigenous people, not only here, but in Canada, right, in North America. Today, there's some 50 million acres of reservation land in the United States, 50 million acres, which is not particularly productively used. But imagine, if you will, that if you could begin to grow hemp, and again, we're distinguishing that from marijuana for the moment. The idea here is that could we design sort of a circular economy for that could take place on the reservations, where we could, they obviously, indigenous people have a long history of growing. There's a long history of actually growing hemp, actually, if you go back and look at it, and then being able to help create jobs by creating the factories to make the building materials, which could then be used on the reservations themselves as the materials to do that.
And to me, that's really a powerful thing about social equity, is really looking at being equitable, right? And not just looking at one culture or what, in sort of isolation, but, how can we as investors in sustainable products and doing all these things really look at all equities, right?
So what do you, if you look out 10 years, what do you think, what do you think you see out there? Are you going to see one or two dominant hemp industries? Are you enterprises? Are you going to see lots of small businesses going around? Do you think Monsanto buys us all? What do you see out there 10 years out?
Cargill, Monsanto.
Cargill, yeah.
So I would say you're probably going to see a little bit of everything, kind of like other industries. You're going to have your craft side of this industry, which we already have now a lot in THC. Businesses where you have brands that embrace a different type of consumer or a different kind of lifestyle. And, like you see in the craft beer, but like sort of every craft beer sort of gets at some point to Budweiser, or Coors or something like that. So, there's a pathway for them. So I see that as still being very prevalent in cannabis. And I think because it's such a cultural plant. But I also see, we're seeing this big tick up now in SPACs, right? And so, SPACs aren't great for every company. They're great for companies that are making money, that can be public, because a SPAC is a public entity, it's a public vehicle. And so if you're going to be, looking at quarterly earnings and working towards profitability and EBITDA and all these other things you need to, it's a great vehicle. But there aren't a lot of those right now in hemp, especially, right? And so, is it the right vehicle right now for all companies? Absolutely not. That's why I think we're going to see this sort of blend. You're going to still see earlier stage investing, probably hopefully more. You're going to see, a lot more of the sort of traditional venture capital and PE firms that are going to be doing a lot of roll-ups. And we're actually seeing that now. We're seeing a lot of companies that started before the 2018 Farm Bill, right? And then they started really growing in 2019, and then we saw prices come down, and now what are they going to do? And, so we're going to see some rolling up of those companies together. And then I think we're also going to see some really interesting things probably haven't even thought of, like this permanent capital, right? Where, maybe some of the top families or the top companies and maybe even some of the Cargills of the world, sort of get together, a little bit as a consortium and really fund an industry and fund the next revolution that's going to happen, in that. So I think we're going to see a little bit of everything, but that's the beauty about this plant that I love so much, is that it does have these multiple components. You don't have to just pick one lane. You can actually cross over. You can decide, I want to be in CPG because that's where I've been. I'm a consumer products person, and I love that space, and I want to be in that forever. And here's an outlet for you. And we're working with Martha Stewart on some of her products and doing these things. And so you're seeing a lot more people coming into the space too, and what we call crossover, right? You're a crossover. I'm a crossover. We're all sort of coming from these different industries and bringing our genius to cannabis and hemp, which is necessary.
One of the things that was interesting for us is recognizing relatively quickly that there was a complete lack of transparency and data, right? So you, as a manager, you'd like to say, well, I make my decisions based on facts. And the answer was you couldn't even find the facts. And I think part of our decision to look broad was to say, you know what, until someone finds a way to collect this data and present it to people and to investors, that you have to sort of start, for us, we've concluded you had to start broad in that way.
And I love the fact that you're really honing in on that and creating this standardization and this process, because what that does is it develops trust. And I mean, I think that's our biggest hurdle for cannabis in general and hemp as well is trust. How do you trust what's happening in the industry? Everything from, do I trust the people running the company for my investment? Do I trust the product? Do I trust the grow cycle? All of these things that kind of, flow in. And I think once we can get to that level of trust, then, sky's the limit.
So, it's very interesting because just very simple questions about the hemp world, like example, which is like how much hemp was grown last year, right? We know down to the acre how much corn was grown last year, but in terms of hemp, no one has any idea. The regulators will tell you, well, I approved this many acres for growing, but I don't know whether they grew it or not. Right. And so you're beginning to understand this sort of the beginning, the nature of the immaturity of the industry, and why it's so exciting for me personally and for my investors is that I think that we're trying to take sort of a big business approach to think about how do you put that discipline and how do we act in a disciplined way to understand what's there, because once we know that, we will know more. I mean, a classic example we were talking about the other day is that if you were making tinctures, right? You're making tinctures and you're going to do that. How many glass bottles do you need? And oh, by the way, is there a shortage of glass bottles now that they're all being used for vaccines? Those are questions that a business needs to be able to answer on its own, right? To begin to know what to make, or even we'll take high grade, which has wonderful strains of hemp that have been developed over many years here, and we have many more coming in terms of industrialization. But the question is, how much needs to be grown? Who's going to grow it? What are the operating procedures to grow it? And then once they do, how does it get tested? And what did the tests say? And we as a grower, we had the same experience everybody else had, which is we would take exact same samples and send them to 4 different labs and get 4 different answers come back to us about what it was. And then you'd say to yourself, how do I even know what I grew? Forget what, and by the way, the regulator then goes like this and says, was this compliant or wasn't it? And so all of that sort of, I think is sort of the excitement of beginning to add this layer of maturity to the business. And I think your investors need to understand that it's still a nascent industry.
That's right.
You can't hold us to the same standards you hold to corn and soybean. We'll get there. By the way, we will get there, but just not right away.
But that's an opportunity zone for investors. Invest in those processes to get there. Don't expect them to be there because it's as you said, it's emerging. So let's invest in that and put that permanent capital to work at that level so that we can do that,
Kim, thank you very much. A very interesting conversation. We look forward to having many more together about all of these topics, and particularly the sustainability and the importance in terms of the ESG investing. I think that'll be a very interesting and rich field for your investors and for us to think about in the years to come.
Thank you, Stephen. It was such a pleasure, and getting to know you and more about your company and Santa Fe Farms and High Grade Hemp and all these wonderful things you're doing.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. On behalf of Kim and myself, there'll be a breakout session to give everyone an opportunity to ask Kim and myself questions live, and we look forward to seeing you at that meeting. Please join us for additional fireside chats. I'll be speaking with Roger Frawa from Coda Holdings, focusing on Native American and indigenous issues, especially with respect to the hemp industry.
That's great.